Well, good evening, everybody. It's just a little after 7 o'clock on my watch here in Scotland, and I think a little after 11 in the morning over there in Vancouver. And welcome along to our Royal Scottish Forestry Society online talk. And thank you so much to everybody for coming along today. If you haven't come across me before, I'm Kat Wilson. I'm the director of RSFS, and if you'd like to find out a bit more about what we do and any future events, please just look at our website. In terms of the format for this evening, as ever, we aim for these to be relatively informal events. So if a question comes to you whilst our guest is speaking, feel free to type it into the chat box and we'll pick it up at the end where there's hopefully time for some Q&A. But by way of introduction, we have such an important topic to hear about tonight and a learned expert to tell us about it. So Dr. Laurie Daniels is our guest speaker today, and she's the chair of the Centre for Wildfire Coexistence in the Faculty of Forestry at University of British Columbia, Vancouver. And Laurie investigates the impacts of natural and human disturbances and climate change on forests and is active in sharing, teaching, and learning with the public. She's among the 150 Canadian scientists recognised for research shaping new frontiers and making our world a better place. And an award-winning professor and researcher. In 2025, she was honoured to receive the King Charles III Coronation Medal for public service to Canada. And so we're deeply grateful to her for giving up her time today to talk to us. So over to you, Laurie.
Thanks, Kat, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm joining you today from Vancouver in Western Canada, the ancestral lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous people. It's an honor and privilege to get to learn and live on their lands. Let me share with you our research, learning from the past and adapting for the future, how we have used research investigating tree rings and forest dynamics and human history on our landscapes to try to set a path forward. We are in a major transition in Canada, driven largely by climate change, but also a century of landscape changes and cumulative effects that we are now beginning to understand interacting with a changing climate is putting us at great risk. Before I go much further, I want to acknowledge the tremendous research team that works with me at the University of British Columbia. I am sharing not only work by me, but the students and postdocs who do heavy lifting out in the forest and engaging with communities and working with me. It's such a privilege and honor to work with this amazing group of researchers. And a special thanks to our collaborators and the many organizations that fund our research. The Kerner Foundation supports the chair that I hold, and we work with anything from municipalities and rural and remote communities, Indigenous communities, provincial and federal organizations seeking solutions as we move forward in a warming climate. The 2023 wildfires in Canada, were capturing the world's attention. We were the epicenter in May of 2023, the epicenter of heat and drought at the global scale. And that really primed our northern forests in Western Canada and the far north for fire. 15 million hectares burned over that summer, releasing a record 640 megatons of carbon into the atmosphere. The smoke impacted people from coast to coast to coast in Canada, and in fact was transported over to Europe. You also were breathing in the UK and in Scotland, we're breathing the smoke that were coming from these fires. The graph in the bottom corner shows the area burned over the record where we have strong and verifiable records of area burned in Canada. And as you can see, the 2023 surpassed not only at the national level, but every region across Canada had record areas burned. The north was tremendously impacted, a serious concern given the amount of boreal forests and peat bogs that were impacted during extreme drought. In case that wasn't enough, almost back-to-back years, 2025 was another record-breaking year at the national level. Last fire season had fires burning again coast to coast to coast. almost 9 million hectares burned, and again, creating smoke and hazardous conditions all across Canada and across North America, bringing fire again to the forefront of our attention. Record evacuations as well through the prairie provinces. I work and live in British Columbia, and so here I'm showing you a map of BC with showing the polygons, the fire polygons, indicating the occurrence of fire over approximately a century-long record. The yellow polygons show almost 100 years of fire leading up to 2016. And then we've seen a real change in the way that fire is working in our systems. Since 2017, we have had among the top fire or record-breaking fire seasons since that year. 2017 was the first year where 1 million hectares burned in a single year. That's about 1% of the province burned in a single year. We surpassed that in 2018, approached that in 2021, and doubled it in 2023. 2024 and 25 are also record-breaking fire seasons, so that 7 of the last 10 years have exceeded the area burned in a century-long record. And looking at the top fires, 8 out of 10 of the top fires have burned also in the last decade. So we're seeing a real shift in the way that fire is impacting our ecosystems, and the size and the magnitude of those fires are having astounding social, ecological, and economic impacts. The map on the left shows the conditions in 2023. That was our benchmark until recently. 2023 had 2,500 fires in British Columbia and just over 250,000 hectares burned. It was the first year where we had great incursions of wildfire into the wildland-urban interface, impacting communities. And in that year, it was the communities of Kelowna and Barrie or Maclure, where we had entire neighborhoods that burned and lost homes. We've transitioned, though, into a condition in the last 8 years, and I'm showing now the fire maps, or the fire danger maps. The colors of these maps show you about extreme fire weather. So they're telling us in the warmer the colors, the more likely we are for ignitions to occur and to be spread. It tells us about the susceptibility of the landscape to wildfire. So back in 2003, it was the southern, southeastern corner of the province that was at risk. And in 2017 through the present, we're finding that we have these heat domes that establish that create hot, dry conditions and extreme fire weather across broad areas of the province simultaneously. And those are the years depicted here where we're having record-breaking fire seasons, over 1 million and up to 2.8 million hectares burning in a single year across these extensive heat and drought conditions. So high to extreme conditions prolonged over the summer. You'll notice as well the costs to our society are escalating rapidly, with over $1 billion spent in 2023 attempting to suppress those fires, and yet 2.8 million hectares burned with tremendous cost to our society. In addition to extreme fire weather driven by climate change, we also know that the conditions of our forests and landscapes are being impacted. And this is where I feel the voices coming from the Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Stewardship, where I work, and the voice of our professional foresters is so important. We're realizing that the type of forest management and fire management to support it has had impacts as well. In British Columbia, 64 million hectares of forests. Well, we have 94 million hectares of land, 64 million hectares of forests, and 24 million hectares of those forests are allocated to timber management. Our goal has been kind of a sustained timber yield model where trees are harvested and then native trees are replanted, but planted at high densities and at densities where the forests grow to regenerate, to produce timber products. We've focused largely on pine species in those regeneration processes. And once the stands have reached a stage where they're fully stocked and there's a high enough density of trees that have met a minimum height, they're considered free to grow. And those stands are left to mature and then subsequently be part of a harvesting schedule 60 to 80 years after that stage. There's very little in the way of interim silvicultural practices such as pre-commercial or commercial thinning. Rather, it's this clear-cut harvesting on a rotation of about an 80-year on average. There are some species and some ecosystems, like the picture in the middle, where we leave seed trees to kind of regenerate those stands. And so recognizing the diversity of species and their regeneration mechanisms, we do have some variability, but even in our harvested stands with leaf trees left behind, the green tree retention is usually below 20%, so that our harvesting patterns on the landscape are consistent with a high severity disturbance across all of our forest management in recent decades. You can see on the right a satellite view of a landscape that has undergone two forms of harvesting. The first is kind of a sustained yield harvest where we kind of created a checkerboard of patches on the landscape where that clear-cut harvesting and replanting was taking place. And then second, after widespread insect outbreaks in the early 2000s, we did a lot of salvage logging in our timber harvesting land base. And so we ended up, as you can see, with a lot of forests that were regenerating simultaneously and very little core forest and habitat left behind. We now are realizing the cumulative effects of this forest and fire management. The fire management component that I'll add in is that on our timber harvesting land base for many decades, we've had a policy of complete fire suppression to try to maintain the economic stands that are being maintained across that part of the landscape. And so we're now seeing the interactions of disturbance cascades and ecological surprises. So our fire suppression policy and our success in British Columbia, almost 94% of fires have been actively and successfully suppressed over my lifetime, which means we've also only ever seen the top 6% of fires that exceeded suppression capability and were burning under hot, dry, windy conditions. One of the factors that resulted from fire suppression and our extensive timber management across the landscape has been an increase in the amount of defoliating and, in this case, bark beetles impacting our landscape. In the early 2000s, 19 million hectares of forests in British Columbia were impacted by the mountain pine beetle. The red trees here were being killed by mountain pine beetle and native bark beetle that grew to the population grew to extensive sizes across North America and has actually expanded its range over its historical distribution, crossing the Rockies into our Rocky Mountain National Parks from British Columbia through the Rocky Mountains and into Alberta. These changes that we see across the landscape with increased fuel, increased proportion of dead trees in the forests, are fueling many of the fires that we're seeing across the landscape at such high and intense impacts. We see this in a single example coming from the Elephant Hill fire that burned in 2017, almost 200,000 hectares, and you can see the dominance of the warm colors, the red and the orange, indicating high and moderate severity fire, some low severity fire at the lower elevations and in some of the valley bottoms, but really a disproportionate high and moderate severity effects in a landscape where we know historically there was an abundance of surface fire, and we know that from fire scars embedded in the tree rings. In many parts of British Columbia, we are now speaking about fire having impacts, not if, but when. And so the question becomes, how do we prepare for and how do we adapt our forest and fire management? How do we prepare the wildland-urban interface to absorb fire and to be able to accept fire and then be able to defend against fire, having impacts like we see. And the pictures in these pictures from left to right across the top is the community of Lytton, where 94% of the community burned in 2021. West Kelowna that burned during an extreme fire weather event in 2023. And simultaneously, the picture on the right is showing the impacts of the Bush Creek fire in the Shuswap region of southern BC, also in 2023. The bottom picture shows the fire effects in stands that are dominated by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, where large trees have embedded in their tree rings 3 and 4 and 5 fire scars indicating past surface fires. But as you can see in this picture, the fires today are burning intensely and severely, killing the trees and consuming all of the organics down on the forest floor, right to mineral soil. Now, I've painted a pretty severe picture. This is what we are experiencing in recent years. And so I want to also take you on a case study. So maybe I can do a quick vote. Maybe if you can let me know how many of you have had the privilege of visiting Jasper National Park or any of the Rocky Mountain parks in Canada. Is it where we can do a thumbs up? I see a few people are voting yes, hands up. Fantastic. I'm seeing lots of you have had the privilege of visiting our beautiful national parks. I'm going to take you to Jasper National Park. And here we're looking from an overview down into the valley of Jasper. The community is just beyond those blue lakes that you can see mid-screen on the right. And you might notice the forest is a mix of both green and a little bit of red and gray. Jasper National Park has also been impacted by mountain pine beetle. It was one of the last bastions in the Canadian Rockies, one of the last places to be impacted, and yet mountain pine beetle swept through between 2010 and about 2015 or 2016 with tremendous impacts on the pine trees within the forest. Jasper National Park was also the location of one of the most extreme fire events that has ever been recorded in modern history in Canada. The Canadian Forest Service has released a report on the 2024 Jasper Wildfire Complex, indicating it's one of the most intense fires with the amount of heat energy being released per hectare on this blaze, which exceeds any other fire recorded in Canada. The fire itself, or maybe I'll back up here. The fire itself burned in July of 2024, and I remember kind of watching the news with bated breath. Tremendously concerned when I heard that the fire had ignited. It was a lightning ignition, and it was burning during one of the most intense droughts that Jasper had experienced. Hot, dry conditions, temperatures that had been exceeding 30 degrees Celsius for 2 consecutive weeks, and very little rain for several weeks in a row. My heart was sinking because our work in Jasper National Park had actually demonstrated that the landscape, again, is highly altered in the last century. Here we're looking at a Douglas fir stump, or a cookie, a cross-sectional cookie from a Douglas fir tree that had established in the early 1500s. And each of these arrows is marking a fire scar embedded in the tree rings of this Douglas fir that showed a past surface fire, a point in time when the fire or the forest had low enough density of trees and a rich enough understory that it could support surface fire without crowning and without crown fire dominating the event. And as a result, a tree like Douglas fir that has thick bark and insulates against the heat of fire was able to survive, in this case, 4 surface fires over its lifetime and still be alive. which tells us that in the past, fires burning through the park had a mixed component with low severity fire in which the trees could survive, as well as high severity components, as we would expect in a northern forest in central and northern Canada. This is a chart compiled by one of my PhD students, Dr. Rafael Chavardas. Here he was working across 29 sites. Each of the horizontal lines is telling you about the lifespan of the trees. So from top to bottom, we have a series of 29 sites. The x-axis is showing us a timeline from the 1550s through to about 2015. And each horizontal line, then the length of the line tells us about the lifespan of the trees at the site. And each one of the red triangles is telling us the date of a fire scar embedded in tree rings at an individual site. And then you can see that in some years, the red triangles are aligning and telling us about widespread fires that burned at multiple sites, scarring but not killing all of the trees. And so what we see is at 2/3 of our sites, we found fire scars indicating mixed severity fires in the past. 11 of the sites had multiple scars where the interval from one fire to the next was anywhere around 11 years up to 165 years. So a tremendous range, but a mean fire return interval of about 60 years across these sites. We also reconstructed the age of the forest and looked at cohorts that had established in conjunction with those fires, indicating mixed or high severity fire components. And we see that 17 sites had cohorts that established after wildfires in the 1827, 1889, and 1905. The 1889 fire in particular was very widespread and initiated many stands, but also scarred many trees, meaning again, mixed severity fire despite a very widespread event that is well documented in the foothills of Alberta and up into this national park. Notice that after 1905 and after the creation of the park, there were no fire scars being recorded on the land. We know now that that change is in part because of fire suppression policies that were accompanied the creation of the park, that there has been active fire suppression for more than a century in Jasper. We know now as well that part of that was the removal of Indigenous fire stewardship, the use of fire to cultivate food and medicinal plants and ceremonial plants, but also to control the vegetation in and around village sites and transportation corridors that were critically important to sustain a low level of vegetation load and fuel load in the case of fire. We've also been able to demonstrate that those cohorts that established in 1889 have persisted. And with infilling of trees growing into these stands through time, we've created a much more homogeneous landscape than would have occurred in the past. This tree ring interpretation is verified when we look at historical photographs. Here we're looking at a set of photographs that were taken in 1915. In Canada, our first topography maps in Western Canada were created by geologists who used photographs and geometry to create topographic maps across Western Canada and through the Rocky Mountains. The Bridgeland survey was done in 1915, and they literally hiked to the top of promontories throughout the Rocky Mountain range and photographed 360-degree views. Here we're looking at the Athabasca Valley with the Athabasca Valley surrounding our tree ring study sites. This landscape in 1915, you can see a mosaic of tones with the darker colors being conifer-dominated patches of forest, the lighter tones being open grasslands and meadows or woodlands with low density of trees, and mixed broadleaf and needleleaf forest with an abundance of aspen in them. The Mountain Legacy Project, led by Dr. Eric Higgs and Janine Remtula, have been rephotographing these landscapes, hiking to these promontories and rephotographing these landscapes over the last 2 decades. And here's their repeat photography of Jasper, taken by Janine in the 1990s. And I might back up just so you can see the magnitude of the change in this landscape. We see now closed canopy, homogeneous conifer forests in much of the valley bottom and the mid slopes, and increased density of the trees right up to the altitudinal tree line. Fast forward a few more years with mountain pine beetle, and apologies to those of you who may be red-green colorblind. It turns out that mountain pine beetle affected trees that are the red tone are very difficult to decipher, I realize, from the green trees in making up that conifer blanket. But here you can see a large proportion of the park and the forest being impacted by that bark beetle, in impacting then the proportion of live versus dead trees in the forest. And so here we see a tremendous change in the landscape, an increase in the conifers, a homogenization of the landscape, landscape becoming increase in density in conifer forests, and then susceptible through climate and interacting insect impacts. I had done work about 15 years ago with Kootenay National Park, where they'd also had a mountain pine beetle outbreak in the 1980s. And they were concerned about the condition of the forest and the downed trees as the snags or standing dead trees fall to the ground and build up fuels. There was concern about the potential impacts for fire behavior. And so here I was part of an experimental or an operational study, so an operational prescribed burn in Kootenay National Park, where we instrumented the forest with thermocouples and installed in-stand cameras and actually measured what was the fire intensity in these mountain pine beetle affected fuels versus adjacent forests with no mountain pine beetle history. And you can see still pictures taken from one of our sample plots on the right-hand side. Although we were burning in early May in 2007, under controlled conditions early in the season when the snow had just melted from these ecosystems, the prescribed fire burned as a crown fire that burned through with high speed and high intensity, consuming a large amount of fuels with tremendous impacts on the site. And so, again, coming back to Jasper, knowing the condition of the forest, the hot, dry conditions under which the wildfire had ignited, and knowing that it was a forest laden with mountain pine beetle affected fuels, I was tremendously concerned as the news broke in Canada. So let's go back to that July ignition. There were lightning strikes on July 22nd, multiple ignitions at about 7 p.m., one north of town, two south of town. The fire weather index, which is a combination of temperature, precipitation, relative humidity, and wind speed, was very high. It was measuring almost 50 on the scale. Anything over 20 can sustain a crown fire. And here we were at 50 after prolonged drought. It was the highest fire weather index ever recorded in Jasper. Temperature at 7 p.m. was greater than 30 degrees Celsius and relative humidity was less than 20. There were points in the days preceding and the days following ignition when the relative humidity was in the single digits. Winds were gusty. They were sustained 30 kilometers an hour, but gusting well above that. And the three ignitions rapidly merged. The fire exceeded 3,000 hectares within 3 hours. And reports from people on the highway was that it went from ignition to crown fire within 20 minutes of the fire igniting. And so we see the fire just outside of Athabasca Falls in the bottom part of this map, rapidly spreading. The village and the town site of Jasper is up near the top here of the view. The fire ignited down in the southeast corner, in the bottom corner of the map, and rapidly spread. 6,000 hectares by midnight after ignition. Oops. The next day, it was at 16,000 hectares and rapidly approaching the community. Overnight, between the 22nd and 23rd, the entire park was evacuated. 25,000 people, 6,000 residents, and 19,000 guests were evacuated from the park. There are three highways into the park, one from the south, one to the north, and one to the west. 2 out of 3 of the highways were closed because of wildfire, and so the entire park was evacuated safely into British Columbia in the middle of the night, on the night between the 22nd and the 23rd. On the 24th of July, the head fire reached the community and spread rapidly along the edge of the community, and then was redirected through planned ignitions from helicopters towards the north or to the right of the scene. The fire was intense. Some of the most impactful wildfire I have seen anywhere in Canada or around the world. It was accompanied not only by heat and drought, but tremendous winds. It created an unverified but strong evidence of 2 fire tornadoes within the fire front. Here we're looking at a view where what had been a spruce and pine forest, all of the trees were blown down or sheared off at about 3 meters height and then subsequently burned. And so you can see mounds of mineral soil exposed. You can see the charred stems. From a helicopter, as we look down on some of these views, the direction of the stems form a large cyclonic kind of circle, which is part of the evidence of a fire-spawned tornado. And here we're looking again from a helicopter down. You can see the exposed mineral soil. You can see the tremendous impacts across large areas. The fire perimeter exceeded 30,000 hectares, and again, much of it at high severity fire. 32,000 hectares and 30% of the community was lost. Fire burned into the west end of the community. The column of smoke and flames kind of on the west edge of town collapsed, bringing an ember shower into town, resulting in about 30% of homes and businesses being consumed. There's been a lot of discussion about the causes and consequences of this fire. And tremendous loss in an iconic park and in a community that is a close-knit community, which has sustained tremendous losses, although no loss of life. We're very grateful for that. I want to also point out an alternate perspective. The media was really focused on the losses and who did not do what ahead of time to prevent this fire from occurring. But what they overlooked was, in fact, 20 years of mitigation that had been taking place. And I'm going to give credit and where it's due. I would say that that mitigation work and the wise actions of the staff from the Canadian Parks Canada meant that 70% of the town was protected despite an extreme event burning under extreme fire weather. Jasper is the home of Fire Smart Canada, a program that helps homeowners understand the changes that they can make to their homes to reduce the chance of an ignition in the case of wildfire. It advocates for roofing materials that are non-flammable, for gardening and landscaping that reduces chance of home ignition, using building materials that are fire hardened or fire resistant. And it also has come up with recommendations and applied those recommendations for thinning and prescribed burn programs that reduce fuel loads in the wildland-urban interface in and around communities. Building on our understanding of the changed fire regimes in Jasper National Park as a whole, Much of their work was also ecological restoration and cultural restoration with input from Indigenous people, telling us that the condition of the forest had changed over a century with fire suppression and altered fire regimes. And in fact, thinning the forest and reintroducing fire were proactive ways to reduce the fuel loads. The fuel loads are in the wildland-urban interface that had been treated. Um, were part of the reason that as the fire approached the community, Parks Canada was actually able to use planned ignitions on the far side of the valley to create draw, to redirect some of the fire, not through the town, but around the town, and move that fire outside of the scope of the urban area. And so their mechanical thinning, the prescribed fire, are factors and ways that we can be adaptive and proactive and use fire to fight fire in this instance, both proactively and in an emergency situation with those planned ignitions during and as part of the wildfire tactics. The maps here are showing you in gold and orange colors the different treatments that have happened around this community of Jasper and as well around the Jasper Park Lodge to the right-hand side in the community of Edith Lake. So these are all neighborhoods where the forests in all of those patches have been managed by Parks Canada in recent decades to reduce fuel loads and try to maintain lower fuel loads and to alter fire behavior in the advent of a wildfire. We are working with Parks Canada. The red dots on this subset of the map show some of the 150 plots that we established in the summer of 2025 to measure the fire severity and fire effects. And I now have a master's student who is working with these data to try to quantify what were the ecological impacts of the fire, how severe was the fire, and to also determine if those treatments helped to reduce the fire severity, how it interacted with the suppression tactics and the planned ignitions that were used, and then to learn what more could we have done to reduce the impacts so that we can carry those lessons forward and share them with other communities and hopefully reduce impacts of inevitable wildfires that continue to impact our Canadian communities from coast to coast to coast. So let me wrap up with a little bit of a theme and then make sure that we have some time for questions. I've painted a picture that is a bit daunting. We live in Western Canada in an era of mega fires. We know that those fires are being fed in part by climate change, but also because we live in a landscape that has been highly altered by industrial forest management practices, but also fire suppression to support that fire or that forest management program in recent decades. We are now experiencing large and severe fires that are exceeding all of our modern technology and suppression capabilities. In part, these traditional paradigms, our understanding of how fire worked, our focus on timber and stand level management has contributed to the homogenization of the landscapes that are being impacted by fire today. And we're learning the hard way that we have low landscape resilience and low social, ecological, and economic resilience to these fires as well. Our communities have proven very vulnerable to fire. And our citizens are not well informed about the conditions in which we're living, that we live in fire-prone environments, and that there are things that we could be doing to change our behaviors and our management choices. So our goal in our research team is to work with management agencies across levels of government and to seek solutions that allow us to learn to coexist with fire, to have fire back on the landscape in managed and controlled conditions, but to also to manage our forests and our communities in ways that allow us to coexist with fire, where fire can be absorbed into our landscapes again without always threatening our communities and infrastructure and ecosystems. So let me give you a few examples where we have managed to make changes. In British Columbia, we have diversified our wildfire management. Dating back a decade ago, our strategic plan began to include modified or managed wildfires, modified response and managed wildfires, where we allow fires to burn where they are affecting areas that will not impact human resources and human lives, but allow fire to burn as part of a healthy and resilient ecosystem. This means in some cases there's larger areas burning, but doing so in ways and under fire weather conditions that add diversity back into the landscape. There's a large investment as well in British Columbia towards ecocultural restoration of fire. It's being guided by Indigenous knowledge as well as our understanding of historical fire regimes through tree ring and other paleoecological research, combined with oral histories. The image in the center is work that came from Dr. Kira Hoffman's work with Indigenous firekeepers across our nation, in collaboration as well with Dr. Amy Christensen from the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and the Thunderbird Collective, Indigenous organizations that are sharing their knowledge very generously. Their voices have been long overlooked, and they are now being brought to the forefront to help guide management choices using fire to fight fire and to reconfigure our landscapes. Work is accelerating in the wildland-urban interface, where fuel treatments aim to reduce fire intensity and the chance of active crown fire and increase the resilience and survivorship of trees if fire were to intercept those treated areas. We do that by thinning the understory trees that serve as ladder fuels and make fire vertically contagious in the forest. We try to reduce surface fuels and increase height to live crown, creating a gap between surface materials and the canopy of the forest. We have developed an extensive research program that includes field measurement and fire behavior models to assess efficacy of these treatments. And where our treatments are intercepted by fire, we go back and monitor to ask, were the treatments effective? So as I described in Jasper, we've done this in a few other places, and I'm showing you again some pictures of British Columbia, where a few of our plots were burned during wildfires in 2021 and 2023. Our sites with no treatment, the modeling indicated a high chance of crown fire, and in fact, the observed fire behavior exceeded the predicted model predictions. We saw near 100% tree mortality and crown scorch in many of the sites, and a tremendous amount of wood consumption on those plots. In the treated areas, we had predicted a lower chance of crown mortality, and we saw, in fact, lower tree mortality and lower crown scorch and less wood consumption, indicating that those treatments are, in fact, working across most, but not all of our sites. We did see that some of our treated sites did have high severity fire impacts in which trees were highly impacted with a high degree of mortality. So the system is not perfect, and we're learning and hopefully building that knowledge as we move forward. There's also a tremendous program, the Fire Smart program in Canada and British Columbia is making, I think, strong headway, working with communities and citizens to help them understand the really small steps that all of us can be taking to safeguard our homes. Anything from maintenance, cleaning gutters and rooftops, making sure in the summer we're not stacking firewood adjacent to our wood siding on our homes, and being aware during fire season how to be prepared in the case of fire in your neighborhoods and in the case of evacuation alerts and orders. So these are some of the steps that we are taking to learn to coexist with wildfire in Western Canada. We're diversifying our management. We're combining Western science with Indigenous knowledge to guide those new management paradigms. We're using evidence-based and adaptive approaches, seeking proactive landscape and community management, focusing on fuels and reconfiguring our forests to be more resilient to the types of fires that we are experiencing today. In addition to the science and updated management, we recognize that we need to educate and engage our citizens. And so we're strong proponents and supporters of the Fire Smart community that aims to engage those citizens and to enhance community protection. And I think that is the last slide in my deck. I will at this point open us up to questions and comments about our attempts to learn to coexist with wildfire in Western Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie, for such a detailed and fascinating look at the issue and some of the possible solutions. So yes, any questions for Laurie, either in the chat box or by raising your hand and unmuting.
Pat, I might stop sharing so that I can open up the screen and kind of see the various people
of
who
course.
are here. Thank you.
Michael, have you got a question?
No, not at this stage. I was just being friendly. But
I
would just to compliment Laurie, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. And the Scottish Wildfire Forum, at its last meeting, it was discussing whether to adopt FireWise from the USA or FireSmart from Canada. And my recommendation was to choose FireSmart from Canada.
I have lived in the US and in a fire-prone environment and worked with their FireWise program, learned from their FireWise program as well. They both have tremendous strengths, but we are investing heavily right now in wildfire in Canada and the Fire Smart program. We've just established at the national level a wildfire resilience consortium of Canada that has knowledge extension experts who are working, and Fire Smart is part of that consortium. Their knowledge extension and outreach national coordinator is Dr. Kelsey Copes-Gerbitz, who comes from my research team. She just left me at Christmas. I'm going to miss her tremendously. She's been such an important part of my team and the outreach that we do with Indigenous communities and community forests in British Columbia. But she's taken on this national leadership role. And I do know that they are hoping to continue to build international connections as well. So I think you would find tremendous opportunity for collaboration through the Fire Smart Canada and through the WRCC.
Laurie, I see we've got a question coming in the chat here. Have recent wildfires influenced what tree species you are seeing planted?
Oh, great question. There's a lot of discussion about how do we adapt to climate change? Do we use, well, maybe if I step back. In Canada, we do plant only native species after harvesting or after wildfire. And the rules in British Columbia until recently were beginning to think about climate adaptation in ways that I think are very adaptive. So we also know a lot about provenances, and there's provenance trials. You know, many of the species that we have growing in British Columbia, Douglas fir as an example, its range starts in Mexico and comes right up through the Western United States into Western Canada. So part of the question is, what provenance do we plant? Do we plant the one that is the local seed source that is adapted to the local conditions, but may not be adapted 30 to 50 years from now? In terms of future climate? Do we start to mix some local provenances and southern provenances? So there's a lot of really, really intensive genetic trials and experiments taking place. One of the things we're very worried about is in our warmest and driest environments, we are not seeing native tree species come back after some of these fires. I work in a region of British Columbia that burned in 2003. And it remains a grassland shrubland. It has not naturally regenerated to trees, and some of those areas have been planted 2 and 3, 4 times in the last 2 decades. So thinking about our tree species, I think there's probably going to be some areas that will not regenerate to trees. And we're going to have to accept that because our climate in some parts of Canada are changing so rapidly that we are no longer in a climate envelope that will sustain the types of conifers that we saw there in the past.
Goodness. We've got a few more questions, Laurie, coming in. So one of them here from Ruri, how receptive have the public been to the efforts to engage and educate them?
Yeah, what a great question. I think our public, and I'll focus in British Columbia, where I spend a lot of time in rural communities. Last summer, I spent my summer on the road with students, and in addition to working in Jasper for almost a month, I was in 15 other communities, and there's an interesting pattern. It's kind of classic cognitive dissonance. The communities that have been threatened by fire are very receptive, and are very engaged and want to make the changes. Some of the communities that have not yet been impacted are somewhat resistant. And so we've seen in some communities concern, and I think this is where my job and the job of others in my field is very important. Um, in some places, we do need to thin our forests, which means cutting some trees. And so we have communities, ardent environmentalists and conservationists who want to preserve the forest as they see it today, thinking this is the state that is best and optimal. So when we tell them we need to cut and remove some of the trees, there's resistance. But I think, again, it's helping people to understand that the forest that we see today is a highly altered forest. And that we can maintain forests. We can thin our forests and maintain the biggest and oldest trees and the ones that are important for biodiversity. And we can be managing the understory to enhance biodiversity. If we do so, all of those can also reduce our chance of wildfire risk. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge, and it's one that we're working really hard to make sure that we hear the concerns and address them honestly, and admit when we've made mistakes and when things have not worked to the best of our ability, and improve, I hope, into the future.
Thank you. And more questions coming in. So Val and Graham say we live within a forest where deadwood creation is seen as a priority for ecosystems. What is your view on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Snags and logs, are an important part of ecosystem habitats, and we've often thought of them as, kind of decadent features of the forest that, they weren't desirable from a timber production point of view, but they are absolutely important from a habitat perspective. But like all things, we can have too much of a good thing. So where we've had disturbance and we have a large number of snags and logs, we end up with fuels that are accumulating, in some of our ecosystems where we have a lot of that material that's not necessarily benefiting any longer. So I think there's a kind of a fine balance between kind of understanding or having a combination of live and dead trees in an appropriate abundance and distribution that serves kind of multiple benefits.
We'll keep going. Another question here. Is there a stems per hectare or basal area that's aimed for when treating an area to make it less susceptible to crown fires? And any other parameters for successful treatment of an area?
Yeah, great question. There have been some guidelines that have been suggested, kind of a 3-meter spacing between trees so that you are less likely to have crown to crown spread of fire. In British Columbia, the Ministry of Forests and the BC Wildfire Service has been quite strict about surface fuel loading of woody material that's less than 7 centimeters in diameter. So less than 7 centimeters in diameter is considered a fuel size that could help to sustain an ignition and spread fire. Anything greater than 7 is considered too large to really be a primary factor in determining whether or not a fire will initiate and spread. So we're trying to reduce the kindling in essence. I would say, though, although there's some guidelines and 3 and 5 kilograms per meter squared would be kind of a number that has been used. In some areas, they've gone as low as 1 kilogram per meter squared. They've said that's pick up sticks and we're raking the forest, which has been suggested by some political leaders, but we don't think it's a good strategy for all of Canada. I think those guidelines, we've tried to not give strict numbers, in part because I work in ecosystems that are anywhere from coastal temperate rainforest, interior dry forests, mountain systems, subboreal forests, and boreal forests. British Columbia is one of the most topoedaphically diverse and ecologically diverse jurisdictions trying to address these issues. So in terms of kind of rules of thumb, we're trying instead to look for ecosystem specific fuel types and fuel loads that we think will sustain surface fire rather than crown fire in the wildland urban interface. And we currently have a collaboration with 35 communities across those 5 forest types to try to come up with some guidance. That's a little bit more specific than what I've just given you.
Thank you. We've got 2 more questions to ask. So one here is, you said more was being invested in this. What is the mix of funding sources and which groups are receiving funds?
Oh, great question. So it is proving that the type of thinning from below and the shifts in terms of managing the wildland urban interface that I have advocated for here, does not generate much from an economic perspective. We're leaving behind the canopy and large trees that would be the ones that would normally go to the mills and generate income. We're removing biomass from the understory and then trying to remove those small trees in a way that does not leave a surface fuel load. So we're talking about costly treatments and investments. We are spending anywhere from, averaging about $5,000 per hectare to remove that biomass in the wildland urban interface. And in a place in steep slopes, in environments like Whistler, British Columbia, a ski resort town with billions of dollars of recreational and urban infrastructure, we're upwards of 20 to 30,000 per hectare to try to remove the fuels and reduce the loads. So you can imagine that's a tremendous cost in a province the size of British Columbia. So there is provincial government funding that supports communities who are working on fire smart in, kind of at the homeowner to landscape level. So you have to show that you have a community wildfire resilience plan, that you're working with homeowners as well as managing the forest around your community to be eligible for those funds. So it's kind of a carrot versus stick approach for that funding, but it absolutely needs to be government supported at this stage in order for communities to be able to afford to do the kinds of treatments in the wildland urban interface. Frankly, in British Columbia, we're probably looking at a $6 to $7 billion problem if we were to address all of the high to extreme wildland urban interface forests. And I keep reminding myself, that's a huge number, and it seems impossible. But in 2023, we spent $1 billion trying to put out fires, and we still burnt down 3 communities. And in British Columbia, we also, when we look at other natural disasters, we're very concerned about earthquakes in coastal British Columbia, where our major cities are. And we have spent $17 billion on adaptation and critical infrastructure in the case of earthquake. So I know if there's political will, there's way. And what we're trying to navigate now is what is the trade-off between engaging the private sector and our forest industry, as well as community forests and municipalities to work together to try to address this problem. I think it's been a real struggle to try to figure out where the onus and the responsibility lies. And it's a really tricky one, and one that we have not yet answered, I think, to the best of our ability.
Great. One more question here. At the Galloway wildfire in Scotland last spring, there was a lot of misinformation online and locally. There's a terrible lack of education in the UK around wildfire. Is this something that's taught in schools in BC?
What a great question. We are having the same problems with mis and disinformation around wildfires and this blame game. The people who don't believe in climate change want it to be a management problem. The managers are taking the brunt of the issue, even if they've done good management. I think it's very demoralizing for those. I think of the Jasper situation where it was the forest managers and the parks people who had been working in that problem for 20 years, who also lost their homes and whose community was devastated, who were being scapegoated in the media. So to come back to your question, is it something being taught in schools in BC? FireSmart British Columbia and FireSmart Canada have created modules that are now in our school programs. So we are getting out. They do have educators out into the public schools. I think this is a bit like pollution and recycling. We started in elementary schools and taught a whole generation to think differently. That's kind of the approach that they're taking through that FireSmart program. But I think we're up against kind of an uphill battle. There's so much mis and disinformation that flies so rapidly in social media. And they say what, for every for every piece of misinformation, we need 5 pieces of good information to counter it and to repair the damage that was done. So we do have a lot of work to do, but I'm hoping, again, through collaboration on these types of questions and problems, that we can find solutions. And again, share information with you in the UK and as well as work from the bottom up, from the ground up, educating people about this tremendous problem that we all face and the solutions that are available to us.
Thank you. And promise the last question. There's been so many questions, but we'll get through them all. Last one here. What markets do you have for small diameter trees for biomass heating and industrial processing? For example, OSB or MDF. In Scotland, the majority of the volume of timber sold is to these markets.
Yeah, we do, definitely. OSB and MDF are two of the places where that material can go. Heating as well, so bioenergy. Um, there's kind of our research forest, the Alex Fraser Research Forest, which is part of our faculty, is actually testing a very local, fine scale biomass-fed energy production system where they now heat our building and create the power for our research center from biomass that comes from this very localized heat and energy production system. What we're finding is, this is so disappointing and so frustrating to me, is that small diameter biomass, trying to move it so that the materials, again, from the thinning or materials that are being generated by the types of treatments and alternative silviculture that improves our resilience, the transportation costs are really high. So you can be in sight of the cogen plant, and they're telling us that it is not cost effective to move that biomass from the forest to the cogen plant. It is cheaper, and we have not yet created the incentives to get that biomass. It's cheaper for them in British Columbia to pile it and burn it at the roadside landing, which is really just carbon dioxide into the atmosphere with no secondary benefits from that waste wood. So we have a lot of work to do. This is probably our biggest barrier. If I had $1 billion to spend, it would be, what do we do with all that small diameter biomass? And how do we make sure that we are not just pumping it into the atmosphere in a pile burn instead of a wildfire? And so I wish I had better answers for you. I know that there are really some colleagues that are working on this. This is the focus of their work in the bioenergy, the BEST program, in our wood science program, in our faculty, trying to overcome these limitations and those economic barriers that frankly are really focused on kind of those short-term gains instead of the long-term consequence.
Laurie, it's been such a pleasure to hear you speak tonight so knowledgeably across such a range of subjects and to spend time with us. Thank you so much on behalf of everybody here, and I'm sure we're going to go and think about our own approach to coexisting with wildfire on the back of our evening tonight. So huge thanks from everybody here, and a real pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah,
well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your fantastic questions.
Really good.